Hello, and welcome back to another episode of FranklinCovey's twice-weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. 6 years, 400-plus episodes aired that release every Tuesday and Friday, where I am privileged to interview some of the world's most renowned thought leaders. Oftentimes, they show up as authors or researchers, academics. In some cases, they are former diplomats, ambassadors, governors, people that have had service to their countries or organizations for many decades. Frequently, it's entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, CEOs, artists, creators, people of all walks of life that have dedicated some portion of their life to create expertise or learn some lessons, or in some cases, survive unspeakable tragedies and summon the courage to teach us through it. This podcast is designed to make you a better leader, formally, informally, in your offices, places of work, or in your homes. FranklinCovey, of course, is known as the world's most trusted leadership company, founded in part by our co-founder and the seminal author Stephen Covey, who wrote the book, amongst many, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Today, I'm delighted to spotlight and converse with William Ury. He is the co-author of the renowned book, Getting to Yes, and the most recent book called Possible. Now, this is an interesting book because it focuses on how we not just survive, but also thrive in an age of conflict, something I think everyone is intimately aware with in our personal lives, our professional lives, or as citizens, as voters of our states and counties and countries, and for those of you who are around the world, of however your country is organized as well. William Ury, welcome to On Leadership.
It's a huge pleasure to be here, Scott. I counted Stephen Covey as a friend back in the day, and so it's just a huge pleasure to be on a podcast.
Well, he is shining down on us, hopefully, and I hope that he and his family watch this in whatever capacity, because in many ways this podcast is a tribute to all that I learned from him and the literally hundreds of millions of people around the world that have either read his books or attended the 7 Habits courses or other things like that. Okay, let's get down to one of the most important things. You share, as I mentioned off air, a great designation, and that is the incomparably influential thought leader and author Jim Collins has written a scarce number of forewords to books. He very graciously wrote the foreword to Dr. Covey's, I think it was 25th anniversary of the 7 Habits book. And he also wrote the foreword to your book. And so I'm not sure Good to Great and Built to Last and How the Mighty Fall and others are any more profound than what's written by Jim Collins. Talk a bit about how this book originated, I think even on a hike with Jim Collins some time ago.
It did. Jim and I, sometimes I'm lucky enough to take a hike with Jim, and he is one of the foremost askers of questions. You know, he's interested. He's really interested in what people's answers are. And he asked me a question as we were hiking up near our home in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains. He asked a question which was, you know, these days, there's a lot of conflict in the world. You spent your lifetime working on how to negotiate conflicts. If you had to sum up everything that you've learned about negotiation and conflict resolution in one sentence, what would it be? There was a long pause. So let me think about that. And then on our next hike a few months later, I thought about it and I had an answer for him. And you know, it's funny because when he first asked me that question, I was really intrigued because I love simplicity, as does he. And the challenge of synthesizing everything into a one sentence was a really tempting one. So, and that was the origin of the book. Once I gave him the sentence, of course, he said, now go write the book.
As Jim Collins would do. William, rewind a few decades, because you've had a remarkable career. You spent some of your early childhood in Europe by insistence of your parents. You learned a lot, but you've had an unbelievable career. Would you kind of start with, you were born where and then what happened, and give us a few minutes on your professional journey, because it's obviously been instrumental to what is your expertise around negotiation, conflict, and your contribution in one of your seminal books, Getting to Yes. Give us your life story, please.
Well, I was born in the Midwest, just south of Chicago, and about the age of 6, my parents took us to Switzerland for a year, and uh, and I ended up spending half my childhood in Switzerland, and with different cultures, a very different culture than the Midwest, and in school with boys from many, many different cultures, from the Middle East, from Asia, from Africa, from South America, from Europe, of course, as well as from North America, with people with very different cultures, different religions, different habits. And one thing about the school too, the boarding school I went to was there was in the bottom of the building there was a nuclear bomb shelter, which was a reminder that things were conflictual out there. That this was not long after the end of World War II. You could still feel the tremors of these two great world wars, and there was every expectation and kind of a dread that there might be a third world war. And so early on in my childhood, I was asking myself, why? Can't we human beings find more imaginative, more creative, more collaborative ways to deal with our differences? There must be a better way. And that was a seed that later led me on to become an anthropologist, to study human beings and our history, our evolution, and who we are, why we are, how we are. And then eventually to focus then on peace and how do we find a better way to deal with our differences than either in the family or in business or in communities or in the larger world destroy our valuable relationships and perhaps even our lives.
Ury, by education, you're a cultural anthropologist, but you've also had a remarkable, extraordinary career in negotiation, including around the world with remarkable prime ministers and presidents, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment. I love the Hugo Chavez story. Talk a little bit about your service to former President Carter and others on negotiating and even peacekeeping conversations.
Yeah, when I was a graduate student studying anthropology at Harvard, and it was 1978, and my mentor and colleague Roger Fisher came in one day and said, I was just on a tennis court playing a game of tennis with the then Secretary of State Cy Vance, who was Carter's Secretary of State. Carter was president. And he said, in about 2 weeks, they're going to have a summit at Camp David, and they're going to bring in, Carter's invited the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, and the President of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, to see if he can make peace. And it seemed like mission impossible. These two countries were the two strongest military powers of the Middle East. They'd fought 4 wars in the previous 25 years. And it seemed impossible. But Carter was game for it. And what Roger said to me was that Cy Vance had asked him if he had any ideas. And Roger had showed him a copy of a kind of loose leaf book that anteceded getting to yes called International Mediation, a Working Guide. And it said, there's a technique, there's a creative technique here that you might want to consider using at Camp David. We call it the one text process. And it's a long story, I could tell you, but in the end, they actually, the talks at Camp David, Begin and Sadat, the two leaders, couldn't get along. There was no chemistry, and things broke down after about 3 days, and they were about packing their bags to go home. And then Carter called in Vance to the cabin there in Camp David and said, you got any ideas? And he said, well, I've got this idea from this professor at Harvard. And so he tried out this idea, which is a different way of organizing a conversation, organizing a negotiation that ultimately was very helpful in producing an agreement 10 days later at Camp David that brought an end to a war between Egypt and Israel and a peace treaty that has endured to this day.
Okay, that's quite remarkable. That story has not been broadly told. I've read about it, but it's pretty interesting. You went on to actually served former President Carter, I think, in the is it the Carter Center? What is the name of the initiative?
The Carter Center,
Carter
exactly.
Center. And you tell some remarkable stories of your travels around the world. One that actually is quite riveting with former South American dictator Hugo Chavez and a serendipitous story. I'd like you to take your time for a moment. Off air, I told you I didn't want any long stories. But on this one, I want a long story because you teach several principles in this story. And I kind of would like you to tell it like you did in the book in terms of what was your first experience there, how was the second one different, the technique you were taught around patience, the solution you offered him. Tell that whole story because there's so many insights to unpack there.
Well, yeah, I got a call from Jimmy Carter and asking if I would go down to the country of Venezuela, which then was paralyzed by political strife with 1 million people on the streets of the capital, Caracas, demanding the immediate resignation of the president, Hugo Chavez, and 1 million people on the streets supporting him with violence and international observers concerned that this might turn into a civil war. And the first time I went to see him, I thought maybe this was going to be, it had been arranged by President Carter, would be a kind of a courtesy call. I didn't know how much he wanted to talk to me, a Yankee, a professor, after all. And, I thought I might have 10 or 15 minutes. And immediately my mind went to, okay, so what's the most useful thing, the most interesting thing, the most provocative thing that I could tell him in my 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes? And then it so happened that a week or so before I was in Brazil and I heard a song in the jungle that had a phrase in Portuguese, which was basically the essence of it was, do not give advice to those who do not want to hear it. And I thought, it struck me like a thunderbolt. And I thought, you know what? That's exactly what I was just about to go to do, to try to tell him something he might not want to hear. And so I decided to take a risk and I studied up on him, of course, and tried to put myself in his shoes, understand his personal history, what his passions were, what governed him, what really motivated him. And I went in there with no agenda. My only agenda was to kind of connect with him. And when I got to the palace, there was a lot of demonstrations outside. People were pounding on the car, a long line of people waiting for him. After waiting patiently, I was ushered in to see him. He motioned me to a chair, and I brought President Carter's greetings, and he thanked me for that. And I had studied up and found out that we had daughters who were both 3 years old. And so I talked a little bit about our daughters. And then I said, they're all over the palace of these giant portraits of Simon Bolivar, who was the kind of the George Washington of Venezuela, in fact, of all of Latin America there. And I knew that he was passionate about Simon Bolivar, that he actually saw himself in some ways as a modern day reincarnation of Simon Bolivar. So I pointed up at the painting and said, I've been reading this biography of Simon Bolivar. What an amazing leader he was. And he immediately lit up and said, that's why I'm here. That's why I ran for president. That's why I was a colonel. And Bolivar said, never open up fire on your fellow countrymen. And I was ordered to put down some riots, and we were going to open up fire on our fellow countrymen. And then I realized that wouldn't work. And he proceeded to tell me the story of his whole life, of how he was in the military, how he started a coup, how he came out of prison, how he ran for president. And I'd say 45 minutes went by, and I was just listening. And then at the end of it, he turned to me and said, so professor, you're a student of, you focus on negotiation. Do you have any advice for me or for us as we deal with this conflict here in Venezuela? And that was the cue. That was, he was asking for advice. Before that, if I had offered advice, if I tried to tell him what was intelligent, I'm sure, I would have been ushered out in 5 or 10 minutes. But simply by listening to him, waiting for the cue, seeing if I could connect with him, just respect who he was, no matter who he is, what a human being is, just connect with the human being there. And then, so I said to him, Mr. President, I've been in a lot of civil war-like situations, and you have an enormous opportunity here, which is to prevent a civil war before it begins. And he perked up and he said, what would you have me do? I said, well, what about opening up a dialogue with your political opponents? And then he flew off the handle. He got angry. He said, what do you mean? You want me to talk and sit down with those traitors? They tried to kill me right here in the palace not 6 months ago. And then I was, okay. So I'm just listening again. Just take a breath. And I said, you don't trust them. He says, you're darn right I don't trust them. And then an idea came to me. I said, well, tell me something. What could they do if you had a magic wand and they would do anything you want them to do tomorrow morning that would send you a signal that maybe they could begin to be trusted? What would that be? Well, he thought about it for a moment. He said, you know what they could do? They could stop, because the opposition owned the private television stations. They could stop going on their TV stations and calling me a mono, which is Spanish for a monkey. And you could tell just as he said it, just the kind of the humiliation he felt at being, called a kind of a racist slur like that. And I said, obviously, it's unacceptable. What else could they do? And he said, well, they could stop putting uniformed generals on the television and calling for the overthrow of the government. But what was so interesting to me about the first answer was that so much of human interaction has to do with simple, basic respect. Even though it was a conflict about power, political power, economic resources, and so on, it boiled down to common, basic respect. So I said to him, well, what if we did a little exercise where we gathered together, some signals, made a list of the things you'd like them to do, and perhaps the signals they'd like you to do. He said, excellent idea. Why don't you do that and come back and report to me tomorrow morning and come back and talk to me again. And I looked at my watch and about over 2 hours had gone by, and we'd begun a relationship. We'd begun to connect. And so that was my very first meeting with Chavez, which was a real lesson in the importance of setting aside your own agenda, trying to say something intelligent, but really just connect with the other human being, whoever they are, whatever you may think of them, just connect with them, because respect is the cheapest concession you can make in a negotiation. The other person's dignity might mean not very much to you, but it means everything to them. And that simple little lesson has served as a very powerful lesson for me ever since.
Let's actually double down on that one. I mean, you have dozens of stories in this book about all kinds of international situations and corporate scenarios, but it was not your only meeting with Hugo Chavez, because you returned and had another, maybe less cordial conversation, and the setting was a little more formal and intimidating, and you were backed into a bit of a corner, and then you actually demonstrated some other opportunities for respect and possible ways to survive and thrive conflict. Will you share story 2?
For sure. So fast forward maybe 6 months, I had another meeting with President Chavez. He liked to meet at night, and this meeting was set for 9 p.m. in the presidential palace. My colleague from the Carter Center, Francisco Diaz, and I were waiting for him 9, 9:30, 10, 10:30, 11, 11:30, midnight, waiting for 3 hours. Finally, we were ushered in to see the president, expecting to find him entirely alone. But we were surprised to see that he had his entire cabinet arrayed behind him. So this was a public spectacle, and he motioned me to a chair and he said, so Ury, tell me, how do you think the situation is going on here in Venezuela? Give me your views. And I looked at him and I said, Señor Presidente, I've been talking to some of your government ministers here. I've been talking to some of the leaders of the opposition, and I believe they're making some progress. He said, progress? That was not the word he wanted to hear. He said, are you a fool? Are you not seeing the dirty tricks those traitors on the other side are up to? And he leaned in very close to my face so I could feel his hot breath and proceeded to shout at me for approximately 30 minutes. And, I was kind of taken aback. I was thinking, oh, all these months of work in Venezuela down the tubes. Here I am, being embarrassed in front of the entire cabinet. And, but for a moment there, I just was able to observe my own sensations, my own feelings of embarrassment. And it's that ability to step back for just a moment. I call that the ability to go to the balcony, which is maybe the foundation of successful negotiation, which is more about influencing yourself before you can influence the other. Imagine that you're negotiating on a stage and part of your mind goes to a mental and emotional balcony, a place of perspective, of calm, where you can kind of remember what your objective is, or what's the prize here. Keep your eyes on the prize. So in that very split second, I went to the balcony, I observed my own feelings. By naming the feelings, I was able to create a little bit of detachment from them and then ask myself, why am I here? Because I was feeling like I was beginning to think, okay, this is how I defend myself. He's calling me he says, you're naive, what could I say? And then I realized, wait a minute, that's just going to put fuel to the flames. What I'm here to do is try and calm the situation, pacify the situation. So I decided to bite my tongue instead and just listen to him and hear him out and watch it a little bit as if it's a play unfolding in front of my eyes. And he was shouting at me, and he was a man who could give hours, give speeches for 7, 8 hours, and he was going on. But without any reaction from me, I was just listening, I was nodding my head. I was really kind of like, isn't this interesting? What's he trying to do? Is this a show for his cabinet? Is he truly concerned? What's going on? Just listening intently to where he is. After about 30 minutes, just watching him, studying his body language, I saw his shoulders slowly sink. And in a weary tone of voice, he said to me, Ury, what should I do? Well, that, Scott, is the faint sound of a human mind opening right there. That's my chance right there. He's finally asking me for advice. So I said to him, Senor Presidente, with all respect, it's December, it's almost Christmas time. Festivities have been canceled because of the intensity of the conflict. Last Christmas too. Why not just invite the whole country to pause for a moment, to take a truce, a tregua in Spanish, for a few weeks, enjoy the holidays with their families, and then come back in January, maybe they'll be in a better mood to listen. In other words, invite the whole country to go to the balcony, as it were. Well, he looked at me for a moment. He was startled by the suggestion. And then he said, you know what? That's an excellent suggestion. And he clapped me on the back and he said, I'm going to propose that in my next speech. His mood had entirely shifted. And what I learned in that little interaction was that perhaps the biggest power that you have in any negotiation, in any interaction, is the power not to react, is the power to step back for a moment, to pause and go to the balcony. Because by going to the balcony, by listening to him, I was able to help him go to the balcony, and then he was then able to help the country go to the balcony. So it's contagious. Your own work on yourself is your best source of influence on others.
William, the title of your book is called Possible: How We Survive and Thrive in an Age of Conflict. And one of the premises, if you will, is that all of us can get better at negotiation, seeking third alternatives, practicing better listening and pausing, if we are what you term a possibilist. Will you talk about what that means? How did you coin that? And what does that mean? What kind of frame of mind or even physical manifestation do you need to conquer the discipline to become a possibilist?
Well, Scott, yeah, the term I've spent the better part of 4 or 5 decades wandering around the planet as as a negotiator and anthropologist, and working in the most intense conflicts from South Africa, where I met actually Stephen Covey at one time, to Northern Ireland, to Chechnya, you name it, Colombia, Venezuela. Um, and people say, well, after all these years, are you a pessimist now about human beings, or are you still an optimist? And I like to say now, actually, I'm a possibilist. I believe in human possibilities. Clearly, we can end up with some negative possibilities, but I've seen with my own eyes in so many situations where people had given up, like South Africa, for example, where everyone was expecting a race war to go on for another 30 years, or Northern Ireland, where Catholics and Protestants, or between Egypt and Israel. So many situations where the seemingly impossible became possible. That's why I'm a possibilist. And being a possibilist means tapping into what are our own innate human potentials. Every child is a possibilist. I have a 2-year-old grandson, Diego, and he's my new boss. I call him my new boss because I'm working for him and his generation. And he's a possibilist. There's a sense of wonder. He's exploring life. There's so many possibilities. And what is possibilism? It means, at its essence, it's mean being curious, bringing curiosity. It means being creative, being imaginative, and it means being collaborative. Curious, creative, collaborative. Those are the three essential qualities of a possibilist, and we all have them. It's just a question of tapping into them, honing them, and then bringing them to these very difficult conflicts that we all face every single day, whether it may be disputes in our family, or whether it's with our colleagues or our boss or our board of directors or our clients or our or our friends, or it may be in the larger community in our country, which is deeply polarized at the moment.
Okay, we could have a 5-hour interview. I'd like you to tell the story about Dennis Rodman on your quest to help with Kim Jong-un situation in North Korea. This is a fascinating story, and as a riveting story, incredulous even, that I'm asking about Dennis Rodman of all people. But I'd love to have you tell the story in painstaking detail. Take 17 minutes. I know we don't have that much time, but there's so many twists and turns to this story about how you finally got to him, and the wait, and the pizza, and the chairs, and the bed, and the return, and all that. And what is there to learn from that story at the end?
Okay, so this is in early 2017. Donald Trump had become president for the first time. When he took office, President Obama told President Trump that his biggest foreign policy challenge would be North Korea, which was headed up by this young dictator, Kim Jong-un, who was busily testing nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles, including intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States. And Trump tweeted in his characteristic way, "This won't happen," and started threatening North Korea with what he called fire and fury, and to eliminate the entire country. And Kim Jong-un also got into it, and they used called him vile old dotard, and Trump called him a little rocket man, and internet experts were.
And yet here we are again. But go ahead.
Here we are again, exactly.
Because we wanted more of that.
And so, experts were saying this was the highest risk of a nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there was maybe a 50% chance of a war. And so I was sitting there. I'd worked back in the 80s, spent much of the 80s working on how to reduce the risk of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union at that time, inspired by my childhood question. And I thought, wow, it's happening again. And what can I do? So I sat down with my colleague, Liza Hester, and I thought, Well, one thing I like to do when there's a very difficult conflict of any kind is write the victory speeches. In other words, think about in this case, write Donald Trump's victory speech. Imagine that he didn't go to war. What would be his victory speech? What would be the 3 key points he would need to say? And what about Kim? What would be his victory speech? I find that a really useful technique in any conflict, in any difficult thing, whether it's your boss, you're asking your boss for a raise. Write their victory speech in which they do what you'd like them to do. They give you the raise. How can that be a victory for them? What could they say to their boss, and so on? Well, I did that exercise with Trump, and there was a lot in the public record, so he had to be able to say, this is the best deal ever. I made the greatest deal in the world. I saved the world from nuclear war. I kept the country safe, and I didn't spend a penny. Something along that order. But Kim, there was almost nothing known about him. And so I went on Google search and I said, well, who knows anything about Kim? Who's ever met this guy? And the only American who had ever met Kim was this eccentric basketball player, champion from the Chicago Bulls in their championship games, Dennis Rodman. And he was very hard to find or pursue. I tried one way, everyone's connected by, 7 degrees of separation, as they say. And so I was trying all my network to see if I could find anyone who knew Dennis Rodman, because he was the only one who had met Kim. And when he had gone to North Korea for a sort of an exhibition game, and it turned out that Kim Jong-un, when he was in school, was a fan of the Chicago Bulls. And so they struck up a friendship. So, one way didn't work, another way didn't work. And finally, I was talking to my uncle who had something to do with the Chicago Bulls back in the 90s. And he said, talk to your cousin, and I talked to my cousin, and my cousin said, well, I went to a cocktail party and I once met a guy who said he was a friend of Dennis Rodman's. He's a coin collector out in LA. Why don't you call him? And so I called him and explained the situation. He said, well, let me see if I can help you. Dennis does sometimes come and stay with me in my house there in Hollywood or wherever it was in the hills. And so I got a call and I made an appointment. We're going to have pizza together. And so I flew out just for the evening, just to have pizza with Dennis Rodman and Dwight, his friend. And I got to this house, and there was no Dennis and there was no Dwight. And there was just a housekeeper from Rosa who said, maybe he'll come along. And about a half an hour later, Dwight showed up bearing some pizza and said, Dennis isn't here? And he likes to go out, to the bars or whatever. He's a little unreliable. And so he called him up, and Dennis didn't even recognize him on the phone. And then he disappeared, and sitting alone there, and the TV was blaring, and Rosa said, "Why don't you eat the pizza?" I said, "Well, no, I'm going to wait for Dwight." He said, "Oh, no, he prefers to eat pizza by himself up in his room." So I'm there all alone, thinking, "Why, on a fool's errand here?" And then Dwight comes down, and anyway, they called Dennis again, and Dwight finally says, "Look, why don't you stay the night here? We got an extra room here, and Dennis might come back in the middle of the night, 3 or 4 in the morning, and maybe you can catch him then." And I sighed to myself, and I thought, well, the stakes are nuclear war here. Do what you can. I canceled my next day's appointments back in Colorado, and I spent the night, and I woke up, and I heard a car going out. I thought, oh, I missed him. It was about 6 a.m. in the morning. Came down to breakfast, and Rosa said, oh, no, that was Dwight going off, the friend going off. But you're in luck. Dennis's car is here. He came back. Do you want me to wake him up? I said, what? She said, oh, yeah, because sometimes he has a tendency to sleep in for a couple of days. He likes to do that. And I said, well, okay, go wake him up. And so she came back, and about maybe an hour later, out comes Dennis Rodman, in full regalia, his nose ring and his tattoos, his earrings and everything, and says, "Bad day, man, bad day. What do you want?" and I said, "Well, I want to talk to you about Kim Jong-un. You're the only American who knows him, and there's a possible war to be prevented here." And so he grabbed a soda. We sat down, and in that next hour and a half, he told me things that were extremely interesting. He told me how Kim had befriended him. He had befriended Kim. He'd been sitting there watching the exhibition game, and suddenly Kim Jong-un plumps himself down next to him, and he invites him out to drinks and party and to do things. And he went to Kim's home. He held Kim's baby in his arms, and he said, I actually believe Kim doesn't want war. He actually wants to engage with the West. He's kind of fascinated. He wants peace. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's not the image you get from the television or the images that people were getting of Kim, which was this kind of ruthless kind of maniac. And then he said to me something. He said, which was gold for me, which was, he said, "You know what Kim's dream is?" Kim once told me his dream. He said his dream one day is to walk down Fifth Avenue in New York City, go to Madison Square Garden, and watch the New York Knicks play the Chicago Bulls, together with Dennis Rodman, of course. And that was like, bingo, okay. Suddenly that's what you want. When you're dealing with someone, you're trying to get to, what do they really want? What do they really care about? What's their dream? It's always something to ask. And I thought, well, what if that could be made true? And I suddenly got the idea, because Kim had also spent time with Trump, because he'd been on the Celebrity Apprentice show and he knew Trump. And that there was a similar kind of interesting psychology that they all shared, all three of them, which is that they were all kind of bad boys. They were all they were all out to kind of prove to the world, to prove the world wrong about them. And Kim and Trump, they both came from wealthy families, powerful families, and they were kind of underestimated. And so there was a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. And I thought, well, maybe, and so Rodman thought, there's a possibility that he could get along. So that was huge for me. And, it was interesting, because 6 months later, I found myself in the White House talking to the #1 expert on North Korea. And I asked, had anyone bothered, to talk to Dennis Rodman? And they said no. No, they hadn't, because, they hadn't taken him seriously. But that's the thing I find, is that in negotiation and conflict, to be able to put yourself in the other side's shoes, understand the way they see it. So really understand, in this case, Kim, and if you can't get to them directly, talk to their friends. Like I got a hold of Kim Jong-un. And that led to, a 2.5-year process where I got involved, engaged, spent time working with the US administration, with my colleagues. My colleagues went to North Korea, we went to South Korea, to try to see if there were some ways to bring both sides together. And in the end, and again, we don't take any particular credit for it, but in the end, Kim and Trump, as you know, did meet in Singapore, which was the first time that an American leader had met with a North Korean leader, the first time the presidents had met. And even though it didn't end the conflict, it changed the atmosphere. A friendship was born between the two of them, and the perceived risk of nuclear war went from 50% to less than 1%. So it was a big lesson for me about the importance of listening, truly figuring out what motivates the other side.
William, in our concluding moments here, you are a world-renowned negotiation expert. You are a practitioner, coach, and advisor to governments and officials. What do people get wrong? Like, what are the common mistakes we make when we're negotiating a sales deal, when we're talking with our spouse about where to go to dinner, when we're talking about an acquisition for an organization or trying to sell a company? What are some of the principles most well-intended, competent people violate?
Well, the first one is to understand that we human beings are reaction machines, and we react. And all the more now with everything coming at us all the time, social media, there's so much pressure on us that we react. And in conflict situations, and when the stakes are high, we get fearful, we get angry, and as the old saying goes, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And that happens more often than not. So the key, as I mentioned, is the ability to step back. And even before you engage with the other side, to go to the balcony, to go to that place of calm and perspective where you can bring your best to the situation. So whether it's dealing with your wife or husband, dealing with your colleague or boss, dealing with your client, the ability to go to the balcony is the foundation of successful negotiation. And from that balcony, then, maybe the most important thing to be able to do is to be able to listen to the other side. Put yourself in their shoes. We often listen, if we listen at all, within our shoes. And we're kind of listening to what they're saying. We're saying, I agree with that, I don't agree with that. We're rehearsing what we're going to say. No, I'm talking about listening where the spotlight moves from your perspective to their perspective. Because if you're trying to influence someone, you're trying to change their mind, we have to begin by knowing where their mind is, and even more importantly, where their heart is. What is really driving them? So those two things, going to the balcony, listening, to me are the foundation then for a conversation where we can tap into understanding what we truly want, understanding what they truly want, going behind the positions, the things that people say they want, for what is it really that's driving them, to then use creativity to come up with options that actually satisfy both sides or all sides in that situation, using the power of our creativity to do that, to rather than just divide up a fixed pie, see if you can expand the pie first. So there's a lot of room in negotiation for the things that are human capabilities, which are the ability to go to the balcony, the ability to listen, the ability to be creative.
William, so many, a trove really of principles and nuggets from identifying and dropping your preconceptions to self-regulation, some great lessons I learned from you, and techniques and tips on involving your palm and pinching yourself and things like that.
Exactly. Pinching the palm of your hand.
It's true. One of the ones that I use is I don't drink sparkling water. I only drink still water. And so whenever I'm in a situation where I'm negotiating something or in a high-stakes situation, I always bring a bottle of Perrier with me, and I hold it in my hand, because I don't drink Perrier, no one knows that, and I grab onto it, and I look at it whenever I'm ready to lose my cool, or I'm gonna give the greatest speech I'm gonna regret. And so you and I have some in common in that. William Ury, you're the best-selling author of multiple books, including co-author of Getting to Yes, and now the new book, Possible, How We Survive and Thrive in an Age of Conflict. What an honor today. Thank you for your service to our nation, to our world, and joining us today on the podcast.
A huge pleasure, Scott, and I wish every one of your listeners and viewers much success in getting to yes.
Thanks again for your time. And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.